So, once upon a time, this cranky little gamer saved all of his allowance and bought a Super Nintendo when it first came out. We're talking within a month of launch. And it was awesome, but for the first year or so, there were fuck all for games. Super Mario World and F-Zero were awesome, as was Link to the Past when it came out. But in the brewing console war, my 12-year-old self grew restless and bored. I mean, come on, you can only play Joe and Mac Caveman Ninjas so many times. So while I played the same games over and over, I began to hear the siren call of the Sega Genesis, with its futuristic-sounding blast processing, which according to Sonic the Hedgehog made everything faster and 10 times more awesome. And they had hip, rude slogans that appealed to my junior high school sensibilities like, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Plus, the Genesis had been out for 2 years longer than the Super Nintendo, so their game library was much larger. Finally, after much deliberation, I elected to sell my Super Nintendo and use the money to buy a Sega Genesis. Of course, within a year of doing so, the Super Nintendo entered its golden age of all the amazing classics you know and love today, but that's a whole nother story. So while it's pretty obvious in retrospect that Nintendo won the console war, I think it's kind of a shame that people have forgotten some of the great older titles for Genesis. I mean, everyone gets nostalgic for Super Nintendo games, even the obscure ones. Pick a random title, I guarantee somebody out there is geeking over it. But when it comes to the Genesis, the only thing people really seem to remember are Sonic the Hedgehog and the fact that Mortal Kombat had blood in it. And if they're really savvy, they might remember some of the tentpole names like Streets of Rage, or Toe Jam and Earl, or Golden Axe, or Echo the Dolphin. Stuff that gets re-released with every single Genesis compilation. But there were some really great titles out there that no one seems to remember. This isn't really a top 10 or top 5 list or anything. It's just a highlight of some of my favorite games that came out for the Genesis. First off, we have Vector Man. I'm going to start with this one, not because it's the least of these games per se, but because it's probably the best known. For as much as it's fallen off the radar since this era, it was huge in its time. I know it's been on most of the greatest hits collection, and when you drop its name, most people don't go, "Oh, what's that?" It's kind of more of a, "Oh yeah." Still, this was a really fun platformer, and it really played around with the Genesis capabilities. Using the balls to animate Vector Man himself kind of gave the game a lot of freedom in its animation, even if it did make him look like it was made of robot bubbles. Shadow of the Beast. Fuck, this game was hard. Shadow of the Beast was a game that I loved, but it just utterly defeated me. It also confused me, as the cover art had absolutely nothing to do with the game, and was actually kind of more awesome than the game itself. This was kind of typical of Psygnosis games, though. The whole company was apparently made up of prog rock fans, because all of their games' cover art was from Roger Dean, who's the artist that did all of the album art for bands like Yes, and Asia, and Uriah Heep. Still, I mean, the game was pretty revolutionary graphically. It was fucking gorgeous for its time. The enemies, to this day, were some of the most bizarre and off-the-wall things I've seen in a game. And when I was that age, I mean, that kind of challenge wasn't deterring. It was, encouraging, like, I can do this. Yeah, I never did. It was, it was just the most punishing game ever. Cyborg Justice. Okay. This one gets by on concept more than execution. I mean, when you take the nostalgia glasses off, like many classic games, this game is fucking terrible. But the concept hadn't really been done before at the time, and this hit when I was 14. I mean, you couldn't get more badass than futuristic cyborgs ripping off body parts and attaching them to themselves. I mean, seriously, you could rip arms, legs, and torsos off and use them as your own. The game wound up being bland and monotonous overall, but I mean, I never really noticed as a kid. Back then, this was still cutting-edge stuff. And you had like a selection of 8 different arms and a bunch of torsos and different kinds of... I mean, you had tank legs. Who doesn't want tank legs? I don't even know what tank legs are. Also, a little fun fact, one of the cyborgs from Cyborg Justice was in the movie Wreck-It Ralph in the Badanon meeting. So at least somebody remembers this game. Kadosh. Getting a little more obscure here, somewhat. Like a lot of early Genesis titles, this was a port of an arcade game. However, unlike most, this is one where I genuinely prefer the port over the original. It felt more like a console game. Yeah, the arcade one just never played well to me. Kadosh is a side-scrolling platformer RPG where you can pick your class, use magic and attacks, gather items, and explore deep dungeons. I prefer to play as the wizard, but you can also choose the warrior. Oddly enough, they got rid of the class from the arcade game. I think it was they didn't do a rogue, it was a ninja. But the Genesis game only has the wizard and the warrior. And each playstyle has its advantages. The game's got a decent length to it, quite a bit of challenge, and honestly, it's just fun. Beyond Oasis. Now here's one we don't see so often. A Zelda-esque RPG set in a slightly Middle Eastern-inspired fantasy world, complete with a main character named Prince Ali. Yet, shockingly, no genie. The game blends several cultures into one action RPG that had some pretty original mechanics and some amazing artwork. The fighting was pretty varied. You know, you could slash, you could spin attack, you had a lot of different moves with your sword. You had a lot of different magics. The game balanced puzzles, fighting, and magic pretty well. It had some really awesome boss fights, and it had awesome artwork for the Genesis for that era. It's just really beautiful art. For some reason, in Japan and Europe, it was released as the story of Thor. Not quite sure how that works out. But the game, it's a shame that this game didn't get more recognition from fans. It did get a sequel on the Sega Saturn, but that was about it. Shadowrun. Okay, this one wasn't exactly obscure, but I don't know many people that played it. Most people played the Super Nintendo version, thinking it was just, a cross-platform port. It was not. The Super Nintendo one was a completely different game. It was a more linear role-playing game, just based in the same world as the Shadowrun pen and paper game. The Super Nintendo one was a straight-up story. You started with one character and followed a linear path. The Genesis one was actually an open-world game. That was kind of unheard of back then. It was a sandbox. There was an actual main story, but you could completely ignore it and just take on all kinds of randomly generated odd jobs for people of all the different factions throughout the surprisingly big world. Cool thing about the story of the game is that it's not told over one, quest line. The game has 3 main quest lines, which you can do at any pace. You can either do them one at a time, or you can do them all parallel, or however you want to play the game. And only by completing all 3 of them do you get the full picture of what's actually going on and what happened. Landstalker. Fuck, I love this game. I could never beat it because of a puzzle towards the end of the game that I could never beat, but up till that point, this game was awesome. It was an action RPG told in an isometric viewpoint that used its camera angle and perspective for a lot of the puzzles. It got kind of frustrating at times because you couldn't really tell, it used a lot of the depth for jumpy puzzles, is that right in front of me, or is it more in the foreground? It was kind of cheap, but it always had some kind of indicator. Combat was fun, the story was surprisingly good, and it had a cast of really great characters. Plus, maybe it's just me, but I've always enjoyed games where the main character is a treasure hunter. They're kind of like a rogue, but without being a sneaky, backstabbing fuck. Maybe I'm a loot whore, maybe it's just because I grew up on Indiana Jones movies, but that sort of archetype has always appealed to me. Dungeons & Dragons Warriors of the Eternal Sun. This was and is my favorite Genesis game of all time. I lost so many hours to this game. You start off, you make your own party of 4 with randomized rerollable stats. And then you set off on a journey of exploration to the Hollow World setting. Concept of the game, your entire castle is sucked into a rift in space and dropped into a completely new world. Your party is tasked by the Duke with exploring it. What's really cool about it is completely based on the original Dungeons & Dragons engine. I don't mean Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, I don't mean 3rd Ed, 4th Ed, no, I mean the original D&D. Complete with every action in the game is taken by simulated dice rolls. Features a wide variety of original, familiar Dungeons & Dragons enemies like gelatinous cubes, carrion crawlers, and owlbears. The game's split between a bizarrely slanted isometric worldview with turn-based combat, and then when you go into dungeons, it turns into a first-person dungeon crawl mode for cave combat. Hell, with your entire party armed with bows or slings, it can pretty much become a first-person shooter. The multiple world maps are big, the game is long, and it actually has a fairly decent story. Like I said, I lost a lot of hours to this game in my youth. I played the shit out of it. So anyway, these are just a few of the great classic Genesis games out there. I tried to limit it to console-specific titles instead of cross-platform ones. Honestly, I had so much fun revisiting these titles for this video. I think I might actually do another one for Sega CD. I promise, though, no make my videos, no matter how great Crisscross and CNC Music Factory were. Anyway, I know a few of these games can be found on Greatest Hits collections. Vector Man and Beyond Oasis are available on the Sonic's Ultimate Genesis collection that was released on consoles a couple years ago. And those two, plus Landstalker, can all be found on Steam. The others, you'll probably have to find an emulator and download the ROMs for. Not that I would never encourage such piracy. So, to those of you that had a Genesis like me, I'm kind of curious. I want to pose a question to you. What were your favorite games? Let me know in the comments, and we'll reminisce and talk about some great forgotten classics. I want to, maybe there were some games that I missed I can go back and play. So thanks for listening, folks. Don't forget to subscribe.